All right. Hello, everyone, and I guess good afternoon. It's noon, so if you please take your seats, we can get started. Okay. I think that's my cue to begin. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Paul Grunewald. I'm the chief economist at S&P Global, and welcome to this workshop on climate and economic modeling. It's a joint partnership and joint organization between S&P Global Sustainable One and the World Climate Research Program. So the run sheet for this part of the program is I'm going to speak for a few minutes, just share a few high-level thoughts. I will then pass it to Dr. Celeste Saulo, who's the Secretary General of WMO, and then Stephane Hallegatte will give the opening keynote address. So just a few notes from me. First, again, thank you to the World Climate Research Program for the partnership. This is what I hope will be the first of many collaborations between the two groups. The sun came out this morning, so maybe that's a good leading indicator of progress ahead. And I think it's fair to say maybe the probability of future meetings is contingent on the outcome of this first workshop. But I am very much, as an economist, looking forward to the collaboration. I'm going to borrow some language from my colleague, Terry Thompson, who's our Chief Climate Officer. This is going to be multidisciplinary. I don't think economists certainly have the answers themselves. The climate scientists don't have the answers themselves. So I think what I'm looking forward to over the next few days is really an honest, high-level, multidisciplinary exchange of ideas, and hopefully we can begin to converge on what a famous economist called the challenge of the century, which is getting our heads around the energy transition and climate. Again, we economists are famous for only citing ourselves in academic journals, so I think this is a great opportunity for me and my economics colleagues to kind of expand our horizons, and again, hopefully looking forward to that. Couple of notes on S&P Global, where I work. We have several divisions, but we have a new shop called Sustainable One. Terry Thompson is in that one. Marion Amio and myself are in the economics team there, but the company's really keen on looking not just at the traditional businesses, but also integrating some new businesses on commodity and sustainability and macro. So again, this is really an opportunity for us, and we're looking forward to collaboration. And maybe finally, on a personal note, I was trained as a mainstream economist. I did my graduate work in growth theory, and I don't think the words climate and environment ever entered my dissertation. So I had my Saul on the road to Damascus moment a few years ago when I read the Dasgupta review from the UK government, which really got me started to think about not just physical capital, but natural capital. I hope we'll be diving into those issues, as I'm sure we will over the next couple of days. But I will now get out of the way and pass the microphone to Dr. Celeste Saulo, who's the Secretary General of the WMO, to say a few words, and then I'll be back to introduce Stephane. But again, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for the WMO, for the venue, and hope that we can have a great workshop. Thanks very much.
Okay, hello to everyone. It's my pleasure welcoming you to the WMO. And following what our colleague said, when I was a student in meteorology, that's my background, atmospheric sciences, I could never have imagined discussing economy and climate. So here we are at times that we need urgently to work together, interdisciplinary and also transdisciplinary, because we know that there are many things going on out there that we don't know, we cannot understand with our mathematical models. So let's be open to these challenges. So it's an honor, of course, to gather with such distinguished colleagues and experts, both here in person and joining us online, for today's keynote address. We are privileged to have Mr. Stephane Hallegatte, Senior Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank Group, sharing insights from his extensive work in this field. This year, 2024, is on track to be the warmest on record, with global temperatures temporarily exceeding 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We are all witnessing the acceleration of ocean warming, rising sea levels, and the retreat of glaciers. Sadly, these trends show no sign of reversal, as greenhouse gases concentrations remain at record highs. Almost daily, we are confronted with heartbreaking images of the human toll of climate change, seen through extreme weather events, scorching heat waves, rapidly intensifying tropical cyclones, unprecedented rainfall and flooding, and prolonged droughts. This crisis is not only an environmental issue, but it is deeply intertwined with the crisis of inequality. Climate shocks pose profound risks to sustainable development, as highlighted recently in our workshop under the World Climate Research Program's Safe Landing Climate's Lighthouse activity. As decision makers, governments, organizations, investors, insurers, we urgently need to understand what types of extreme events lie ahead. This knowledge is crucial for adaptation, mitigation planning, and the development of robust early warning systems. We must recognize the broader impacts on food security, health, political stability, and financial resilience. This is not simply a physical science problem we can address in isolation. It demands a transdisciplinary approach, one that blends expertise from physical and social sciences, economics, finance, and health, integrating diverse knowledge and skills. At WMO, our recent United in Science report, prepared for the Summit of the Future, emphasized this need for interdisciplinary action. Additionally, our State of Climate Services report demonstrated how pivotal climate information and services are to achieving global goals. In this context, the World Bank Group's country climate and development reports play a vital role. These reports help countries strengthen adaptations and resilience while advancing broader development objectives. I am very much looking forward to hearing from Stephane Hallegatte on the lessons learned from these reports and his perspective on the current knowledge gaps. Later today, you'll begin the workshop on coupled physical, economic, and financial impact modeling right here at WMO. This event will bring together scientists, economists, and financial experts to advance our understanding and improve methods for quantifying the macroeconomic impacts of physical climate risk. Today's keynote will set the stage for those discussions. Thank you all for joining us here at WMO. I am confident that today's sessions will be insightful and impactful, providing a foundation for the important work we all have ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Celeste. I think she did most of my work in introducing Stephane, but Stephane told me to use the short version of his CV because if we use the long version, which is extremely impressive, we will take the entire amount of time for his speech. So I will give the super abbreviated version to introduce our guest, Stephane Hallegatte, who's the Senior Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank Climate Change Group. He joined the bank in 2012 after 10 years of academic research. So we missed each other. I left the IMF across the street in 2008. But Stephane has a very impressive and broad range of research interests, including the economics of natural disasters and risk management, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, urban policy and economics, and green growth. He has been the author of dozens of articles published in international journals, also several of the key flagship World Bank reports: Shockwaves in 2015, Unbreakable in 2016, Lifelines in 2019, and Adaptation Principles in 2020. Mr. Hallegatte holds a degree in engineering from École Polytechnique in Paris, PhD in economics from École des Hautes Études and also in Paris. So Stephane, it is a great pleasure to have you today, and looking forward to your address, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think I have to say that I started working at Meteo France on weather forecasting before I just moved to climate and then economics. And so last time I was in this room, I was still working for Meteo France. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Saulo, for allowing us to have this workshop here. So it's really a pleasure to present this work. I'm just back from Baku at the COP, where we arrive every year with a summary of our country level work. So those country climate and development reports that we have started to do 3 years ago. And really the goal is to complement the work that is being done at the global level with global models and global tools with a country per country approach. So we're really very bottom up, working in every country. The reports are being led by our country teams in countries, and we're trying to look at how to align climate and development in a country per country way. We have committed to do all of the low and middle income countries in 5 years. Right now we're covering 72 countries, so we're slowly getting there. And what I will do today is to use the summary that we published at COP just last week, but focusing only on the parts on the physical risks and resilience and adaptation. I invite you to have a look at the full report, where we also discuss other dimensions of the climate and development challenge. And every year our summary is a little bit different. This year our focus is on people. And we did that because we felt that, especially with modeling and economics, very quickly you discuss a lot about big aggregates, and you lose a little bit the fact that at the end of the day, it will be people being affected and also people implementing climate solutions. So we wanted to really put forward the role of individuals as victims of the change, but also as actors able to respond and to implement solutions. So I won't go too much into the details on that, but feel free to have a look at the report. So just very briefly, and just trying to move the slides with this, doesn't seem to be working for now. Oh, yeah. Probably need to point somewhere. Okay. Okay, I'll try to go slow. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what we have covered, and I don't know if you're working in a specific country, but if you do, I really suggest to go look at those reports in the countries, because I will only be able to do a very rapid brush on the substance, but every report really gets into the very detailed country contexts. And one thing I want to say is we said that those reports are not climate reports, they are really development reports, because we're not interested in the vulnerability right now. We're more interested in the long-term prospect of those countries and how they can be successful at achieving their development goals, reducing poverty, universal access to water and sanitation, energy, and so on, even though they also have to deal with climate impacts and they also have commitments to reduce emissions. So we cover a lot of countries now, about 2/3 of the population and economy of low and middle income countries. And we will keep working on those reports as we go. One thing I wanted to mention is the fact that we cover also small island countries, and they are not very helpful to get you big numbers in terms of population covered and GDP covered, because they are really small. But it's really interesting to see the specific vulnerabilities and opportunities in those countries. So we published our first 8 small island states CCDR this year, and it's really interesting to look at the difference with bigger economies that have different challenges and different opportunities. So what I will try to do today is to focus on the impact and resilience aspect. And I want to start with a very short summary of the key messages from all of these reports. And apologies for the very dramatic background of this slide, but it's just like, to get a sense of urgency into those findings. Findings that, if I frame them in a positive terms, beyond the risks and the impacts that we all are aware of, is really the opportunity of using resilience as a way to accelerate development and poverty reduction, and the opportunity to use development and poverty reduction as a way to build resilience. So making sure the development process are such that they are creating resilience. What we find in those reports is that there are a lot of opportunities to do better, to build infrastructure better, to have social protection system that better cover people, a lot of things that could be done with very high returns, and they are not being implemented. And so we're really trying, instead of focusing on the negative, focus on all of those opportunities that basically governments are leaving on the table. They could implement, but they are not implementing, and there are barriers, which I'll discuss a little bit. But I think there is a lot of synergies that we can capture to give people a better life. But of course, we have to keep the balance, right? You'll see that even if we implement all of these perfectly designed adaptation policies, it's not like we can protect people fully. And so these opportunities to do better adaptation doesn't replace first being able to respond when something bad happens, and also a rapid reduction in emissions. So we're trying to keep this balance right. For this workshop, I thought that what would be useful is to discuss the methodologies and also all of the gaps and things that we would like to be able to do in those reports and we're not able to do in those reports. So I'll just jump into the methodologies that we apply. And I was very happy to be invited in an interdisciplinary workshop, because when we started on CCDRs, the first thing that I was trying to impose is not to have our energy person doing an energy section and our water person doing a water section and our macroeconomists doing whatever macroeconomists do. What I wanted is first to look at the sectoral work and the risks and the opportunities, and then have the results of the work at the sectoral level being implemented in the macro and microeconomic work. So the idea was really to force people to work together. And the methodology, as you'll see, is really just trying to implement that. And just to give away a little bit, the philosophy is not to have in macroeconomic models or like any sort of economic model a super simplified version of the physical science or the engineering version of it. We don't want economists to have to reinvent energy planning and water planning. What we want to do is to find the right interactions between the experts in energy and water and the economists, so that they can use the results of the detailed analysis done at the sectoral level. And so, of course, the first step that you see here is to look at the direct impact on people and the economy. And so in a very usual way, right, you start with the climate scenarios, of course, CMIP scenarios like everybody else, and then to mobilize our sectoral experts. So we have hydrologists, we have agronomists, we have experts in all sectors to work with their models to try to look at the impact on different dimensions that will then affect the economy. And so sometimes it's directly the climate models. Sometimes it takes another model. So here you see from the Tunisia CCDR estimates of the change in water supply and water demand. And it means that you have to look at how irrigation demand will be affected by temperatures and so on. And sometimes it's from the health literature and some experiments on labor productivity. So we're looking systematically at the effect of higher temperatures on labor productivity outside. And what you see on this figure is how lower income countries are much more affected by the direct effect on labor productivity, not only because agriculture is playing a much bigger role, but also because of the lack of mechanization of agriculture. So it's much more like physical work outside that directly impact their labor productivity. We're looking at long-term trends, but also, of course, at extreme events. And so here, and I think nobody will be surprised by this kind of figures. So you see probability of occurrence expressed in return period on the x-axis, and the losses expressed as a percentage of the value of the assets in the y-axis, looking at how the probability of different bad things happening is changed in different climate scenarios. So that's really the material that we're dealing with, and that we do a lot with others. We don't work alone on this because it's not our core expertise. So this is a lot about managing the relationship with FAO or universities working on those aspects. The next step is to connect the results of those things with macro models. And here's just an example from the Côte d'Ivoire CCDR, where you have as a rows different what we call impact channels, so different ways the climate change will be affecting the economy. And in the columns, the variables of the macro model through which those impacts will be going. And so it's really like a step-by-step process. For instance, the labor productivity example, of course, is directly connected, but morbidity and mortality, we implement in the economic model through the labor supply. So that basically the number of people and number of hours that they will be able to work. And so different countries have different impacts. And so this connection matrix looks different in different countries. This is one example from Jordan. So, Jordan is the most water scarce country in the world. And what you see on the left is an expected decrease in precipitation by 10–20%. We connect that through the availability of water in the macroeconomic model. And on the right-hand side, you see the impact on economic growth. The first three bars are for 2030, 2040, 2050 without water scarcity. And then as you move to the right, you see with water scarcity. And the point I wanted to make here is there is the direct impact. That's very easy to capture. And then the two last blocks are for two assumptions in the macro model. The first one is with the assets and the production factors being fixed. So basically your agriculture sector becomes less productive because you have less water, but you still have the same number of tractors and the same number of people working in the sector. Another version of that is when factors of production are completely fixable. So basically you will be using your tractors to produce computers. I'm just extrapolating a little bit. So both assumptions we know are wrong, right? We know that there will be some adjustments of labor and some adjustments of what you use to produce, but we know this adjustment won't be possible because you cannot use tractors to produce computers. So, and we don't really know, and that's really one of the key challenges that we have, how much of this adjustment will be possible. And we know that this adjustment depends also on policies being implemented, for instance, retraining of workers. But it makes a big difference in the economic model, what you assume on this ability to reallocate and how you support that. It's not only GDP. This is an example from the Iraq CCDR, where we look at the impact on food prices. So on the left, it's the price for producers, and you have a lot of price inflation, which might be good for farmers because they sell for higher, so they get a better income. And on the right, you see the consumer price. The impact is lower because there are imports that can compensate for the domestic impact. But this impact on food prices, if you think of poor people who tend to use 60% of their budgets to buy food, this is a major blow for these people. And in all of our simulations, the key effect through which poverty increases due to climate change is through food prices. And so here again, how much your global market for food functions will be absolutely critical. And right now it's not working really well. So when you have big impact on food production, you have people starving, not because we're missing food at the global level, but because food is not going where it's needed. If we don't fix that, you have those huge impacts on nutrition, on child development, and on poverty. I want to just say a little bit about the natural disaster thing, first, because that's what I did my PhD on. So it's still, particularly of interest to me. That when the first economists started to look at natural disasters, they have a capital stock variable in their model. So you have damages to assets, like you're losing roads and factories and so on. You just reduce the stock of capital in your model and you're done with it. And a lot of what we have done in the last few years is to show that this is too simplistic, because you really have to treat separately infrastructure services, because infrastructure are more affected and because they are key for everything else. And you really have to look at how different assets are working together. So for instance, your factory can be absolutely pristine and unaffected. If you don't have power and you don't have a road getting to your factory, your productivity will be affected. And that is not captured in the first generation of model. So here, we were just trying to do that better, and also to improve how we model the responsiveness of the economy to mobilize resources to rebuild and reconstruct. And you know, if you look at Katrina in the US, for instance, in a macro model, the amount of destructions that Katrina caused, it's 2 weeks of US investments. So in a very aggregated model, you rebuild New Orleans in 2 weeks. You know, not a great assumption if you want to assess the consequences. So getting much more detailed on how the reconstruction is being decided and financed is really a thing on which we have focused quite a lot. So here you have an example from the Turkey CCDR where we look at the impact of those shocks. And if you take into account better the economics of reconstruction and so on, the amount of impact is much, much higher. One thing, and I don't know if we have people working on monetary policy in the room, but one of the things that we were able to look into in that work is how the response of the central banks will be critical. And there are very few central banks in the world who have ever worked on natural disasters. It's really not part of their mandate. But what we show is if you have a disaster and what you want is to finance a reconstruction, but because it creates inflation, the central bank tighten the monetary policy and make the cost of borrowing higher, you're basically making it more difficult for firms and people to just rebuild. And so for the central bank, it's a key problem that you want to tighten to reduce inflation, but you want to loosen monetary policy to facilitate the reconstruction. And that's the type of challenges that are new to these people and that we're trying to bring them with those CCDRs. So on Turkey, I was showing you the impact of one big shock. Here, it's for Morocco, the impact of floods in general. And so we're looking at how much of an impact those disasters have on here GDP in 2 scenarios. One point is, even when we do the modeling right, communicating those results is really, really difficult. So I was trying to find a good way of communicating the fact that here you see the yellow line, it's the average effect of floods. But it's not like an annual loss, right? It's sometimes you have a bad flood and you have a big dip. And so to communicate the fact that this drop in average GDP will not occur as a reduction in GDP, but has a series of shocks, because we don't know when those shocks will occur, it's very difficult to just communicate to people who have no idea what we're talking about, right? They tend to, if we have one scenario and you have a big flood in 2034, it's just like, wow, something really bad happened in 2034. Why that? And it's just random. But communicating to policymakers who give you 10 minutes to explain this type of complexities is really hard. So this is the summary of what we find in all of our CCDRs in terms of GDP losses for 2050. And you see poor countries being more affected, but it's not that simple because small islands, even if they have a high GDP, are also very affected just because of geography. So there is no simple one-size-fits-all, but we're just trying to communicate those type of risks. But I think what's really interesting are 2 things, right? One is GDP is a really, really, really bad indicator to communicate climate impact. A lot of people are looking at those numbers, 10, 12%, might be manageable. Only if you start to look at the impact on people and what it means for nutrition and child development and security and safety and so on, you start to understand the share of impact. So I never fixed that problem. Like everybody wants to know the GDP impact, and I think it's largely irrelevant. Still, whatever we do, the number that gets quoted in the press is always the GDP impact. So if you can fix that for me, I would be very happy to hear from you, because that has been a challenge. Another thing that is really interesting is where those GDP impacts come from, because here it's more connected about what I can do about it. And one thing that to me is really, really striking, and sorry, these figures are a bit difficult to read, but in low-income countries, most of the impacts are direct effect from climate to people. Health, labor productivity, children development. In richer countries, most of the impact is through extreme events on infrastructure systems. So you have very different type of damages, very different types of priorities for action. And what is really worrisome is it's much easier to adapt your infrastructure to natural disasters than it is to adapt labor productivity and health to higher temperatures. And so adaptation is much easier in rich countries. And when people are talking about adaptation spending, adaptation needs, Sometimes you have very small numbers in poor countries, and it's not because they are not affected. It's because there are no good adaptation options. And so a lot of people are talking about adaptation needs, and I think there is a big bias that people read adaptation needs as the amount of impact. This is completely wrong. In many countries, adaptation needs are low because there are no good adaptation solutions. And it doesn't mean the impact will be small. So we have to be very careful with those numbers. Last point on the GDP impacts, they can be reduced with a lot of solutions that we're identifying in those reports. This is what is now called the COMET figure, where you see how GDP losses can be moved to the right, so reduced by adaptation interventions. And that is all of the things that could be done and are not done at the moment, and that with those CCDRs, we try to raise attention to those opportunities. But of course, as I said at the beginning, it's not like you can cancel all of the impacts. Now, just the last step in the discussion is once you have those GDP impact and so on, if you want to go to the impact on people, firms, and with this question on financial stability, which I think will be a topic of our discussions, we have a last step. And I want just to illustrate it on two countries. One is Morocco. So I showed you the impact on GDP. Here, what you see is the impact on the financial system, with the first red bars is the effect of the GDP impact on non-performing loans, which is how banks will be affected by those impacts. And on the right, you see the effect on the capital adequacy ratio, so whether your banks are still able to function or not. And so we can translate those GDP impacts into something that is more relevant for some of our users that are not interested in GDP impacts. They want to know if the financial system will be stable. And this is another example from the Philippines, to show you the problem with that. So here, same thing. We have typhoons in the Philippines, the change in the probability of occurrence on the left, the impact on GDP on the right, and then we do the same thing. We look at non-performing loans and capital adequacy ratios. What you see here on the left is if you take the economy in the Philippines in 2019, and you have this increase in risk, and basically nothing happens. So the banking system in the Philippines is able to absorb even a 500-year return period typhoon. What you see on the right is if that happens during COVID. And here, the impact of the typhoons is magnified like 50 times, right? And that's because you're in a situation of already fragile system where the additional impacts react very non-linearly and you're in big trouble. And I think that's a big challenge that we face is we do climate change work, and we tend to assume that everything's fine and you just have climate impacts. But the problem is the world is not, a very quiet place these days. You have wars, you have crises, you have a lot of other things happening. And the problem is, how can we capture this impact when you have multiple things happening at the same time? And we don't have a good answer for that. So just to finish on the on the tools and basically all of the limits and problems that you will fix over the 2 next days. And I illustrate that with a Paleolithic tool because sometimes it feels a little bit that's what we're working with. The first problem we have is that our impacts are very partial. There are some things that we can model very well, and so we model it and we're very happy about it. There are a lot of things we don't know how to model and we just ignore. In all of the CCDR's GDP assessments, there is no conflicts, there is no migration, there is no imported impacts from the rest. And it's all assuming that climate is your only problem. You don't have your financial system affected by aging that makes everything more difficult. And so I think this bias to go toward what we can model and that we know well is really a big challenge. And the two others are really the fact that we have this step-by-step process where we're looking at macro effects and the implications. But in fact, a lot of what's happening is going directly to people. And that's what I wanted to finish with. We have this step-by-step approach because it's convenient. We can do it. The problem we have now is it's missing a lot of the disaggregated impacts on people, firms, or banks. And just to give you an example, if you increase malaria in a country, what we will have is when you model it in the macro model, it will be like a 1% decline in productivity. No big deal. But in fact, it will happen with maybe 1% of the population losing 100% of their income, right? It's very different if 1% of your population loses everything or if everybody is losing 1%. And so the fact that we're doing this step-by-step approach is missing a lot of the very granular thing. And so I really hope that we can get better at agent-based models that really model firms and people as just the unit of analysis, because I see that as really a way of avoiding this mask that the aggregated assessments give us. So that's what we're doing in poverty, and I think we can be doing it for much more sectors. So I'll stop here. I've been a bit long, but basically the short conclusion is that there is a lot that we still need to do, and we don't have time because we have the questions that policymakers and decision makers are asking right now, and we don't always have good answers. So this is one of those situations where sometimes approximate answer is all we can have, and it's important to make sure it's not wrong. It's only approximate. So that's a little bit what I see the goal for the next days. Thank you.
Stephane, thank you very much. I was taking tons of notes, and I think you gave us a lot of things to think about over the next couple of days, and where we've made progress and where we continue to have some gaps. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so I'm sure many of you have questions. So why don't I open it up to the floor? If you have a question for Stephane, please raise your hand and identify yourself and push the little speaker button by your microphone. Yes, sir. We'll start over here.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Blanz from University of Hamburg, and I really like the steps you take. So each of these steps is important, but what I'm missing is the arrows in the other direction. So the feedbacks, right? The macro impacts depend on the behavior on the micro level. The physical impacts depend on the policies on the macro level, and so on.
Yeah, let's just go here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very good point. And it's not that we're not looking at it. It's just that I had to pick my battles for this presentation. Summarizing a report is very difficult, but 72 is quite a challenge. So we're also looking at the other way around. And the way we do that is not to try to model the coupled system, because I think there is a problem when you get things to get too complicated. And so we have separated the two issues. For the other way around, what we're looking is at first country own objectives and targets in terms of emissions. We're also not looking only at the climate objective, because sometimes the objectives in terms of deforestation and environmental protection and so on are as important. And when those objectives are not where it should be to be consistent with the global goal, where our teams are designing more ambitious scenarios. And then we're really only asking the question of how countries can develop with those more ambitious objectives in terms of emissions. But the two tracks remain separated. And anyway, if you're working at the country level, it has to be, right? Because otherwise you have to model all countries at once, because for the climate, that the sum that matters. So we don't have a choice. And that's why I'm presenting this work as, I mean, we're thinking really hard from the World Bank, what can be our value added. There's a lot of people doing great work. So this work is really not meant to replace all of the work done with global models and IAM and so on. It's really a complement that the added value is that everything is done with governments and so on, so it's relevant for them. But by working at the country level and by working with some political constraint that you can imagine, we do something very different from what global models can give us.
Yes, sir, over there.
Hi, Stephane. Thank you very much for the presentation. Could you elaborate a bit more on the labor productivity results you showed, especially the methodology part? Thanks.
Yeah, it looks like an easy one, and it's really not. And so the key challenge that we had, and by the way, we changed our methodology in between years. What we're doing for the next generation of CCDR is not what we were doing at the beginning. So we have those sort of like impact curves, right? Linking wet bulb globe temperature to labor productivity. And they come from either experimental design or from very patchy and a very small number of in situ assessments. So already the relationship between the wet bulb globe temperature and labor productivity is not something that is very known very well. But the key challenge is to connect the climate scenarios with the wet bulb globe temperature, because it depends on much more parameters that the climate models are giving us, or some parameters that the models are not too good with. And so there are a lot of uncertainties, and it's really striking that by changing our methodology after year one, we more or less reduce the impact by like 30–40% by just changing the way we go from the climate models to the wet bulb globe temperature estimate. So that's a little bit where we are. I think the next steps really is to have much more assessments, which is our assessments like in real world, right? When you really look at people's work. And there is another thing that I wanted to flag is now we have much better data on the impact of air pollution on labor productivity. And those things, again, we model them as separated, but there are strong interactions between air pollution and climate conditions. And that is also something that we're missing. Last point, which we're working on at the moment, is people still think that the labor productivity depends on the situation in your the place where you do your job. And what we kind of see is that this is way too simple, right? If you cannot sleep because your house doesn't have AC the next day, even if your office has air conditioning, your productivity is not as high. And so there are a lot of complexities in that I think we're largely missing.
Okay, the gentleman in the back.
Leonard Borchert, University of Hamburg. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about how these non-monetary impacts that you talked about, that you touched upon, how those could enter these types of assessments or how they already do.
Well, so I think there are two dimensions, right? One dimension is it would be really nice if people stop thinking that GDP is the right metric for this. And as I was saying, that has been a really frustrating thing for years, right? And I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult is because of the lack of ability to aggregate. If you're looking at my slide, even you have a nice aggregation for GDP, comparability across countries, all good, and then you have a series of examples. And communicating on examples is really, really hard. And so I think we're really trying to. And by the way, that's what we, not me, but the World Bank did when the World Bank created this $1 per day poverty line. And everybody was screaming, saying, oh, this is way too simplistic. Poverty is this multidimensional concept and so on. When the World Bank did that, then people started to track the number of people living with less than $1 per day. And the attention on poverty exploded just because every year we could publish a paper saying, oh, it went down, it went up, it's not fast enough, we can set targets. And so I think we're going a little bit in the same direction now. We just created a metric to count the number of people at high risk from climate-related hazards. And again, it's very partial, but we basically think that even a very simplistic metric that is multidimensional, but can be aggregated across countries and comparable across countries, will give us something that will complement the GDP impact and help us communicate about that. So that's the first notion. A second notion is that we're not capturing well the impact of non-monetary thing on monetary things. And so one of the things that we really wanted to discuss in that book is the impact on children. If you're looking at what's happening when you have big drought and so on, the impact on children's health, educational achievement, and cognitive and physical development lasts a lifetime. And this is not captured in those models. But basically, you have people who will be affected for their entire career and life. And in some big disasters, you even see the impact on the children of the children. That is not in those models, but that's this idea that maybe we don't care about that if you're doing a 10-year forecast of GDP. But if you're looking at the long-term implications for like 30, 40 years, like we're doing here, there are a lot of new channels that needs to be brought into the economic model. And that's why we need the economists in the room to work with them about how we capture those longer term things. One last point, one thing that's when we worked on the small island, I was thinking about quite a lot is what is the risk of people saying there is no future for these places and I stop investing in them? Because if you have this shift of expectations, the impact will be much bigger than any physical impact that we can imagine. And since we're talk about finance, I had recently a big financial firm that I will not name showing us their new fancy tool to take into account risk in their investment decisions. And it was a super simple tool and all of Vietnam was red. So basically the signal strong was just don't invest in Vietnam, it's highly risky. And Vietnam is just the place where you need to invest because the risk is high because they are missing a lot of things to manage risks. If you were to do the same thing nobody would ever invest in the Netherlands and Japan, right? So one of the concern is how do we make sure like those risks, they are real, they need to be taken into account, but they don't turn into let's focus on low risk places only because there are people living in those places and they need investments and help.
Thanks very much. Okay, right here in the front, ma'am.
Oh, sorry, got it. Kirsten Tonicke, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. Thank you very much for this very insightful talk, and also the report is really impressive and stunning. I'm a bit surprised by your statement. You rightly acknowledge that we have a triple crisis between climate, biodiversity, and development, as you state in the report. Yet the report has rather small coverage of the impact on ecosystems, or put it the other way, on nature's contribution to people, which is a very important line or lifeline on all the activities. What is your view and what actually needs to be done to strengthen this line of research to get a grip? Because there's ample evidence also in the impacts side from the ecosystems and also biodiversity side.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and I'll be very transparent on the questions we're asking ourselves. So first, different reports have different focus on that. So I was leading the one on Brazil, for instance, where naturally you have much more on ecosystems, and because what happens to the Amazon is driving basically a lot of the impact on agriculture and the rest. And by the way, that's one of the other points to your question, where it's not very easy to separate the adaptation resilience thingy with what you're doing in terms of the emission reduction policies and so on, because deforestation is really at the crux of the question. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to bring the ecosystem services into the picture. You'll see like in the Brazil one or the Indonesia one, we discussed that. The summary reports we went with at COP28 was much more focused on those aspects, but we're not very happy with where we are on this. And that's in part because even though we have a lot of evidence, the tools are not at the same level. And the work that we did on connecting climate to macro modeling, especially, we're doing at the moment to connect nature with macro models, but it's much more complicated. And again, it's even more the problem we have with climate, that it's very partial, with where we take into account what we know how to take into account. That's pollination, relatively easy on ag productivity, but there are a lot of the other ecosystem services that are a bit more complicated. Moving forward, one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, so we created those country climate and development reports to connect development and climate. No, clearly the direction of travel is to do more on nature. And we have started to just expand the scope. At the same time, we're well aware of the risk and cost of trying to expand the scope too much, because then you're losing your focus. And so I think to me, it's still a question whether you need to have a separate track to discuss those issues, or if you can just make all of the tracks in the same place, at the risk of not being able to just go to the level of details that is relevant. So this is still a very complicated question. We have the same issue when we're looking at our financial role, like the loans that we're giving to countries. We track nature and we track climate separately. And the question is whether you bundle the two or not. It creates different incentive for teams, for countries. So it's not a very easy discussion. Expanding the scope is not always a good idea. This is my point.
Okay, I think we had, I don't know who was next. Got a bunch of hands, this gentleman here.
Thanks a lot, Stephane, for this presentation. It was super nice. I was wondering, we just finishing this workshop on extremes, impact, and cascading shocks. You are showing impacts assessment from the World Bank, but not necessarily much about cascading shocks, because you said, hey, that is difficult when everything interacts with everything. So we can do some specific case studies, storyline, stress testing to explore specific situations. But how to generalize that to basically map the uncharted territories? What do you, the World Bank, need from us modelers to generalize these assessments to map these uncharted territories? Do you have insights? Do we need to generalize that? Or can we simply showcase using such examples? So yeah, curious about your opinion.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one, and one of the issue we have, which is also connected to the issue of complexity, right? That if you start to put too many things in the same place and it starts to be difficult to communicate what you really find, it's hard to get people to act upon it. So my advice, and we at the World Bank have been investing in a small team a lot on this without the success that we hoped we would. So this is something on which we still have to work much more, is this idea of decision making under deep uncertainty, where I think the philosophy is that you don't start with the shocks. And that's because the shocks are very uncertain. They tend to have probabilities of occurrence that we don't agree on. Some people are much more optimistic than others. And so everything you do always look like too pessimistic, too optimistic, and so on. And so to me, this entry point of what is the risk of that is the wrong one. I much prefer the entry point of a concrete decision that a policymaker has to do. So for instance, you're building, I don't know, you're developing a new city, right? And so the question is, okay, I don't really know those risks linked to acceleration of sea level rise. I don't really know what's going to happen to the Amazon. So can I identify some scenarios that will have some unacceptable impact on my project? And if you identify that, without even getting into the question of the probability of occurrence, I know that there is a scenario that is not completely crazy that would lead to impact that I consider unacceptable. What can I do to just remove this vulnerability? And if you have to get to the probability, you get to the probability once you have identified the solutions. And one example of application of that was on the port of Los Angeles, when they were looking at the next updates and how much higher they would need to make it. And they basically got to the point that they would do the higher upgrades only if the likelihood of an acceleration of the sea level rise was more than 10%. And it was really interesting because on the science part, nobody would agree on the likelihoods, but everybody agreed it was lower than 10%. And so the decision could move on. Same thing on the coastal management plan in Louisiana. So it's not working that well now, but the first one, it started with everybody fighting about sea level rise until they applied this type of approaches and they realized that the solutions that was proposed in the plans were not dependent on sea level rise. So basically what made sense with low or high sea level rise. And so while at the beginning, the different parties in the Louisiana Congress were just fighting about the scientific assumptions, which make no sense because they have no expertise for that. At the end, they managed to vote for the plan in a unanimous way because you could show that it doesn't matter. So that would be my suggestion, is really not to start with the problem, but to start with possible solutions and being very concrete to show how additional information on those cascading effects or tipping points can really inform those decisions. I think the other way around has not worked very well for us so far.
We got one in the back and then Terry, and that's probably the last 5 minutes. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Karl Schmedders, IMD Lausanne. We are a private business school and I teach a lot of executives in Africa, in Southeast Asia. You have given us a beautiful layout of a research agenda. Lots of academic papers will be written. People will get tenure, win prizes. Great. Academically fantastic, and I strongly support this, and I advise the young people in the audience, follow this agenda. The impact will be zero. It's an academic exercise. It's an academic exercise with zero impact. Who are the big decision makers in the world? The CEOs of the big companies. Microsoft just paid $1.5 billion so that 3 Mile Island, not far from where you work, comes back on. Here is a statement from one of my largest clients, a large state-owned bank in a developing country, taking an active role in driving our country's long-term growth. And I asked them, what does that mean? That means getting people out of poverty. I love that you say GDP is meaningless, but poverty to them means get people into energy. They are financing coal-powered plants because they have the mandate of their government to do this. If we now model this and you say, oh, Switzerland, instead of 10% land lost, we lose 20%. When I'm the CEO of Nestle on the other side of the lake, my predecessor was just fired. That doesn't mean anything. Oh, 20% instead of 10%. My KPIs are I need to increase profit. That's why my predecessor got fired. So where is the tragedy of the commons in all of this modeling? When I am South Africa or Indonesia, I don't do anything. A banker from a very large African bank says, Karl, do you know what sustainability is for me? Water, clean water. And when I have solved that problem, it's energy. Whether it comes from coal or oil, I don't care. I have these people sitting in the classroom in Switzerland. So all of this macro modeling, it's an academic exercise. And I love it because maybe I can write a nice paper.
So
Yeah?
maybe I can...
So the issue is at the World Bank, this macro model is not getting us anywhere. You need to put pressure on the large companies and the governments. But the governments in your home country is a prime example that resonates with my audiences. Macron wanted to be re-elected. He had a brilliant idea, car pricing.
Let me
criticizing you.
Let me try to answer to your question.
Criticizing the profession. What are we doing? And Macron wanted to be re-elected. He says, oh, carbon pricing is not going to get me re-elected. So let's move on to forget about this. And he got re-elected. Good for him. So that's the issue here. We are not modeling the right things. Okay, and we're not having the right.
Okay, we get it. So Stephane's going to try to
we get the point. So let me. So it's not very easy to do shortly, but first, I never said that the GDP is useless, right? I said it's not a good metric for climate impacts. It's very different from saying that GDP is not important because GDP growth is the driving factor behind poverty reduction and access to energy and so on. So we know that we need at least $15,000 per capita in GDP to get people to any metric of decent life that in rich countries we consider to be the bottom. So it's not that we're not pushing for that. When you're saying you need to pressure, we're not in the business of pressuring. We're the World Bank. We're a bank. We lend money to governments to finance their development projects. And we have learned the very hard way that we're not pressuring, we're helping. Governments and countries know what their priorities are. They are countries with a legitimate government and they make the decisions. We're not making the decision. I'm not too obsessed with the tragedy of the commons at the global level. Yes, it's a challenge, but I think what we see in all of our reports is that there are a lot of things which are in the self-interest of governments that could increase economic growth, increase resilience, and reduce damages to the environment generally, including reduced emissions, that those governments are not capturing now, and that they can do even if they don't care at all about the global public good. So we have a program for global public goods. We do result-based finance, where we support carbon markets. We're doing a lot of things so that countries contributing to the global public goods get some reward out of it. But this is not where most of the action is. Most of the action is today, if you're in the Sahel, the best way of bringing electricity to people is renewable energy. It's not entering because there are some financial constraints that makes it very difficult for private finance to just enter into that market. If we help governments remove that barrier, we get renewable energy in these places, you will be reducing emissions, you will be bringing electricity to people, jobs, and development. Yes, at one point, we'll have to discuss how we get to net zero, but in those countries, we're so far from there that it's really not the problem. I really don't need to fix the tragedy of the common at the global level to just help bring renewable energy in the Sahel. And you're asking if it's an academic exercise. So you'll find on the website our first operationalization report that's showing how the recommendations made in those reports are being implemented. So now we have billions and billions and billions of World Bank commitments going towards the recommendation of this. But just to give you a sense of how it works, at the World Bank, with all governments, we have what we call a country partnership framework, which identifies the key priorities. And it's a negotiation with the government. Like, what do you want us to help you do? And this is informed by 4 diagnostics, one on economic growth, one on poverty, one on public finance. And the last one is the country climate and development reports. So what we do with those reports is to identify those priorities and then to engage in the negotiation with governments about what we can help them do. And you will find a long list of projects, and it goes from a project in Turkey to help small firms move away from fossil fuels to electricity, which will increase profits and revenues and reduce dependency on imported fuels, to what we're doing in the Amazon with some communities to provide jobs that are not linked to deforestation, to some big, massive projects in Indonesia in renewable energy, for instance. So those recommendations are being implemented through our own portfolio, but also because in the discussion with governments, this work. So the value of this work, frankly, is that when we present it, it's with the head of state or the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister. And it's very interesting that very often you have our counterpart in the Ministry of Energy, for instance, or the Ministry of Water, has been trying to convince the Ministry of Finance that this is a really good thing that we should be doing and failing to do so. And they are very happy that because we do this work that integrates everything and that our main counterpart is the Minister of Finance, we can say, you know what, we looked at it and just in terms of efficiency of spending, you shouldn't spend so much in your energy subsidy. If instead you were doing some social protection systems, you would spend like half the money and get double the poverty reduction out of it. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it gets implemented. And I'm not saying everything's great. I mean, we see the world, right? But I don't think it's an academic exercise. My presentation was very focused on the methodology, so of course it looks like this. But at the end of the day, what really matters is all of these reports have 5, 6 key priorities that we bring to the governments and that we're trying to implement.
Okay, I know we're over one final question. Yeah. We'll give Terry Thompson, our Chief Climate Officer, the last word here.
Thank you, Stephane, for the presentation and the discussion. So coming back to GDP as a terrible metric, GDP per capita, and focusing on how are we going to combine our concerns about impact on the physical world, impact on humans, and impact on nature and biodiversity. Is there anything going on in your organization with regard to using physical capital, natural capital, and human capital, stocks rather than flows, as the measures whereby we can at least combine, compare, and track annually, if not hopefully, the impacts in an aggregated way?
So this is a great question, and something on which we have been working with many others for a very, very long time through what we call the Changing Wealth of the Nation reports that we publish every 3-4 years. And really the goal was to do exactly as you suggest, to track stocks and to be able to make statements like, if you take a country, I think it is like Zambia, who was extracting a lot of resources, non-renewable resources, and not reinvesting those resources into education or building infrastructure and so on. If you look at the stocks, you have a decline in the stock of non-renewable assets that's not compensated by an increasing stock of human capital or physical capital. And just to flag to those countries, you might be growing in terms of GDP, you're not becoming richer. You're becoming poorer because you're consuming your wealth that is from your natural resources. And so the goal was really to be able to flag those cases. The technical issues are enormous to do that. And non-renewable resources is relatively easy, even though we learned the hard way that technological change sometimes makes your non-renewable resources explode, right? We of course, shale oil and gas being the example. But for natural resources, it's really, really complicated because we don't have a stock, right? It's all of the question of how much your renewable resources needs, what stock do you need to make sure you continue to replenish your stock, which is really, really hard. But to me, it's a very, very key question. The US, it's interesting to look at what the US is doing, right? Because they have a 15-year program to try to complement their national accounts with natural capital accounting. And we're working in countries where the availability of data is nothing to be compared with what they have in the US. So it's a really challenging thing. I think it's what we can do now is identify sort of like worst offenders. I mean, places where things are really going wrong, but we're not. I mean, I would be very careful with the results of our work on that, just because it's really difficult to collect the right data.
Yeah, that's a fantastic report, by the way, the Changing Wealth of Nations, right? I think it was about 5 years ago from the bank, but Terry, to your point.
The new one just published October 15th.
Okay, we have a new update, 5-year update. That's great. So, yeah, but you have the flows and then you want to connect the stocks over time and make it consistent. That's difficult even in finance, right? With the balance of payments, but with these different types of capital, that's super difficult. So we are out of time. Thank you, everyone. Stephane, let's give Stephane another round of applause.
Thank you. Great question.
Again, I think you've given us a lot to, I guess, chew on over the next couple of days. We all took copious notes, and I think this is going to filter very much into our discussions. But thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you again, Stephane, and looking forward to the rest of the workshop.